Hello, everyone. Welcome to the New Humanitarians webinar. I'm Paisley Dodds. I am the Investigations Editor for the New Humanitarian. I'd like to do something a little bit unorthodox as far as webinars go, and start with a little story that should hopefully frame our discussion a bit. Whether you're an aid worker, a lawyer, or a journalist, a lot of us in the course of our careers have probably come across people, I know I have, whose stories you can't seem to shake. You're constantly wondering how they are. You're constantly wondering whether you've done enough to help them. And for me, that story and that person was a woman in Haiti named Marie. I had gone to Haiti to investigate UN sexual abuse and exploitation as a journalist. And I met Marie, who described to me how she was just 13 when she was raped by a UN peacekeeper and passed around to other UN peacekeepers who had been deployed to the country between 2007 and 2008. Like a lot of the Haitian women and girls who I had spoken to, Marie said that she was left pregnant and abandoned by the UN peacekeeper who allegedly abused her. Investigators have also found that there were some 200 women just like Marie in Haiti who had also become pregnant and then left by the UN peacekeepers who had abused them. Unfortunately, more than a decade has passed. Her case, like hundreds of other Haitian women's cases, has made very, very little progress, partially because the UN has blocked some of the legal avenues that it would need, that their lawyers would need to take the cases forward in Haitian courts. I probably don't need to tell everyone who's joined this webinar that women like Marie aren't alone in terms of waiting for justice. In Marie's case, because justice and the definition of it varies from person to person. For Marie, she always said that she just wanted to get some support to raise her daughter on. She also wanted to make sure that no other women had to go through what she went through. The reason why we call this webinar today follows our investigation that we did recently. We published it in late September. And it basically looked at how 50 women in Democratic Republic of Congo told us how they were sexually abused and exploited into sex for work schemes during the Ebola outbreak. Most of the women said that they were abused or exploited by the World Health Organization. Some other women also named other UN agencies as well as NGOs. The common thread in most of their stories is that they said that they felt like they had no choice. They also said that they didn't know how to report the allegations, and they weren't confident that anyone would do anything about it, even if they investigated. To date, none of the women who we interviewed have said that they have met any of the investigators working the cases. After our investigation, WHO, several UN agencies and NGOs who were named by the women promised that they would investigate. We are unsure what has been happening with those investigations yet. So that brings us to our webinar. We have a lot of ground to cover today in today's discussion. It's probably going to last about an hour and 15 minutes. I'm hoping that the panelists can somehow steer us along a roadmap of what justice may look like for some of these women and some of these survivors. Everyone who's tuned in knows how complex and huge this issue is. I'm hoping that we will be able to focus in on the justice aspects, but I'm completely conscious of the fact that we won't be able to get to everything. And we certainly don't want to oversimplify things. The panel discussion, as I said, will be pretty focused on justice. We won't be able to talk about gender-based violence, which of course is related. We also probably won't have time to talk about the sexual harassment aspect. Just a few housekeeping bits. The session is going to be recorded and streamed on Zoom and Facebook. Some of you are probably now tuned into Facebook. We're hoping that the recording will be available in a couple days. And in probably a couple days to a week, we will also do a story looking at some of the key takeaways. In addition to our wonderful panelists, we're also doing something pretty cool today that I'm excited about. And that has to do with the fact that we're going to have a live illustrator who's going to be drawing everything that is being discussed. Her name is Naomi Bennett, and she'll be illustrating and hopefully sharing her screen with all of you as the discussion progresses. In terms of timing, we're hoping that each panelist will talk about 10 minutes with some follow-up questions. I'm hoping to leave at least 20 minutes for some of the pretty amazing and pretty tough questions that, that all of you have handed in so far. So we probably won't get to all of them, but we're hoping to, again, leave about 20 minutes. So without further delay, I'd like to introduce our first panelist. Her name is Naomi Tulay-Solanke. She is the Executive Director of the Community Healthcare Initiative in Liberia. And she herself is a survivor of sexual abuse and exploitation, though not within the aid sector. Our second panelist is Yasmin Suka. She is a human rights attorney who has sat on several panels looking into investigating sexual abuse and exploitation. One of those panels involved the horrific allegations that all of us are probably very familiar with in Central African Republic. The third panelist is Priyanka Chirmar. She's a former UN attorney and founder of Action Against Prohibited Conduct. I'm hoping that she will talk to us a little bit about using the parameters of the system to help women who may have been abused by it. And lastly, but not least, is Caroline Hunt Mathis. Caroline has worked as an international human rights investigator, specializing in sexual abuse, exploitation, and gender-based violence. And she is also a UN whistleblower. So we already have lots of questions waiting for Caroline on that. So if we can start first, I think one of my first questions would be to Naomi. You're a sexual abuse and exploitation survivor, not within the aid sector, but as a girl growing up in Liberia, you have talked about the fact that such exploitation was all around you. Your sister was almost beaten to death after rejecting the advances of a Nigerian peacekeeper. And one of the things that you've talked about in the past is this idea that impunity is so related to justice and a hurdle in survivors actually getting justice. So I'm hoping that you can talk a little bit about that and specifically about what this idea of impunity does to block the avenues for any sort of justice for these survivors. Naomi?
Yeah, okay. I hope the internet will be on my side. Hello, everybody. I'm honored to be on this panel and not just on this panel as a survivor of SGBV, but as a voice that able to amplify what survivors are actually going through, the hurts, the pain, the impunity that we continue to see normalized. And it's about time that we all call it out. We are not calling it out because we want to make people look bad. We are calling it out because we need change in system. We need more people to survive. We need justice. So whenever I'm called to speak about issue of SGBV, especially within the aid system, it's something that resonates so deep with me because I'm yet to stay healed from my pains. I'm allowing myself right now to go through it. So to be able to be in the space to talk and share my own lived experience, it is also an honor so I can be able to give voice to other people who actually want people to hear the pain and want to have justice to the issues that are affecting them. So growing up in Liberia, we had 14 years of civil conflict. And we all know that whenever we are in civil conflict, there are aid workers, there are peacekeepers. These people are coming into the aid of people who are in need of those services. But what we have been able not to do is to actually dismantle or interrogate those aides, the roles that they are playing, the sort of power that have been transferred to them in the space where a lot of people are disempowered because they have lost their livelihood. They are vulnerable because they need food, they need assistance. So when they see, especially the white peacekeeper, even police, uniform peacekeeper or aid worker, is that sort of release and that power that is given to them. Nobody had actually assess it and see, no, we need to check people, we need accountability. Now we are all talking about safeguarding. So growing up in Liberia, the violence was so visible, the sexual abuse, the physical harassment. We saw it in peacekeeper was regarded as god and goddess. Nobody checked them out. The amount of young girls that are left in Liberia pregnant and have to manage the children, the amount of women that was physically or sexually assaulted and there was nothing done. It left everybody feeling that when you are in crisis, you are not only vulnerable to the crisis, but you're also vulnerable to those who even come into your aid. And how do we actually assess that part that these people are not coming because they are coming to do free work? They are being paid. They are using donor money. They are having access to funding. So they have access to power. They have access to fund. They have access to influence. And they are coming into the spaces where they are vulnerable women and girls. And they use that power, for instance, to even distribute food. And they have to sleep with you to give you food that is supposed to give you free. And nobody have actually to say it's about time that we hold these people to account. So having this conversation right now, one might say it's late, but I'm happy that we're having it because there are other countries, there are other people that are still in having natural disaster. We know we're in a whole pandemic right now. We know there are underdeveloped countries where aid workers are still working. There are countries that are still in armed conflict. Having this conversation is actually demanding a change in the system that people have been over the years not comfortable to have this conversation.
That's great. Thank you for Naomi for that. You've talked a lot about the fact that the first step in a lot of these things is actually having women know what their rights are. Given the situation in Liberia, two questions for you, and then we'll move on to the next panelist. Do you think that women, given everything that you've seen and everything that they've seen, do you think that people actually understand what their rights are? And do you think that in a country like Democratic Republic of Congo, whether in 10 years' time, women there will actually understand that the things that were happening were wrong and that they had a chance to complain about it?
Yeah, giving people the rights, especially the women, to understand that what the rights are is so important, because once you know your rights, you are able to hold people into decision, or people who have power, you are able to hold them to account. You recognize that what they are doing for you is not a favor. What they are doing for you is a role that they have been assigned to help you alleviate you from your stress or whatever it is. But it's that sort of power. It's a power play. Whenever we say shift the power, that's when localization come in. If we start to look at the aid work right now in empowering people who are at the community level, when disaster happen or when conflict happen, they understand the context, they understand the issues that are affecting them. And most of these people are women. They are young women, they are traditional women, they are rural women, they are within the community, and they are responding. They are responding with a whole gender lens that they cannot explain. They understand the cultural dynamics, they understand the religious dynamics, and they are responding in the community. But it's the whole bureaucracy thing that says that they don't have the right papers, they don't have the right document to have access to the funding. So when these peacekeepers come in, they come with those sort of power that they take over immediately and start to abuse people. And when they abuse you, it's okay. Nobody hold into account, because again, who's supposed to hold into account? it's a whole boys club. Where are you going to, like, now we have safeguarding. Like, I run an NGO right now, and when we go into community, we explain safeguarding first. We never had safeguarding being explained to us when we were facing crisis 14 years ago. We never had nobody telling us what our rights are, even as refugee, even as internally displaced person. But now we are seeing the shift gradually. People are explaining what your rights are. And the more we explain, the more we make these whistleblower, these stories, holding people to account and say, these things are happening. I am a survivor. I'm on this platform and say, yes, I have a daughter at the age of 14. My perpetrator is yet to be brought to justice. I have a sister who was abused by peacekeeper, and that is just impunity. And when we start to have this system, when we see people losing their jobs, people are being persecuted, the culture of impunity is not normalized, and people are held accountable for what they do. We're going to see there'll be more life saves. There'll be more women happy living a healthy life. There'll be a decrease in sexual gender-based violence among aid workers and even peacekeepers. We need to have a system that hold people to account, and that system can only work when people are more knowledgeable about their rights and how to claim their rights.
Thanks, Naomi. Those are all really good points, and I think that you're seeing the questions in the chat and all the remarks. So I hope that women worldwide can learn from one another, and we can keep up that momentum. You made some really important points. And the issue of impunity is one that Yasmin can talk at great lengths for. Hopefully, in our investigation, one of the questions that kept coming up is this idea of whether what we found was actually criminal, and how to actually look into these allegations framed in terms of criminal accountability. So Yasmin, I'm hoping that you can speak a little bit about this, specifically about your experience, and also if you wanted to mention the idea of reparations for survivors.
Thank you, Paisley, and thank you to Naomi for really setting the scene. I think the context in which we're grappling with this issue is the fact that the United Nations and peacekeepers and aid agencies and humanitarians are really meant to come into a country to provide protection, ensure prevention, and of course promote the rights of people. But of course with them, and I think Naomi refers to it, is this question of the power constructs and the helplessness and disempowerment often of the recipient community. And so it's really, I think, ironic that when you look at who the perpetrators are, then of course these are the very people that are meant to protect the people that they've come to support. And so I think it really raises these questions of the systemic issue of sexual exploitation and abuse, which I don't think we've really got to the bottom of. And even though there's a zero tolerance policy that has been reiterated over and over in the UN system, the reality, of course, is that on the question of accountability, particularly criminal accountability, and the question of reparations, we have a long way to go. And for me, this, of course, came up, and it was interesting when listening to Naomi. I was thinking back to when I was a commissioner on the commission in Sierra Leone, and two issues came to us. The one, the fact that humanitarian workers who were in charge of IDP and refugee camps in both Sierra Leone and Liberia were in fact, asking for sex in exchange for giving young girls their rations. And of course, this is the worst kind of abuse, because you can imagine how dependent people are on the rations to survive. A second issue was, of course, when the Nigerian battalion went home, and you had hundreds of women lining the streets to the airport because all of them were conscious of the fact that they also had children from many of the Nigerian peacekeepers. And what was really important for them was the question of citizenship for their children, because in Sierra Leone, the laws were quite strict. A second time for me, of course, was when I was investigating Sri Lanka, and the issue that you referred to, I think, in your address, the story of the women that stayed with you, was the fact that we uncovered that Sri Lankan peacekeepers had been involved in sexual exploitation and abuse. And this was, of course, with a number of underage children. Now, of course, the investigation did lead to 1,000 people belonging to a contingent being repatriated. But what really struck with me was the fact that when we tried to find out what had happened to these soldiers and whether there'd been any accountability, of course, I think something like 24, and then it was just for lower level crimes. But I think it was the investigation in the Central African Republic that really brought home to me how disempowered victims of sexual exploitation and abuse are. You know, in the Central African Republic, there had been these allegations that French peacekeepers had been implicated in running a ring, really, with underage children in car. And so the Secretary General was forced to set up an investigation, of which I was part. But what was interesting about that one was that because the Sangaris had a separate agreement in terms of the Security Council, the UN didn't really regard them as having to be responsible for them. And so these children were left really abandoned on the street until there was a big media release around the fact, and you could identify the children. And of course, the French civil system sent out an investigating magistrate. The children were interviewed. There was no legal protection for them. And at the end of the day, the French decided that they would not mount any kind of formal investigation. Now, what CAR had to, our investigation had to look at was whether, in fact, these things did happen, and we were able to say that they did. But secondly, also to look into whether the UN had done enough. And I think that's when we began to realize how systemically the UN is not really structured to deal with allegations that really deal with people in their own ranks. Now, I think we picked up on the question of the challenge really behind the fact that you need peacekeepers, and that you have the status of forces agreement in which the peacekeeping forces have to take responsibility. But the UN does have a what we call a human rights due diligence policy. And we said that, in fact, on that policy, the UN itself should be held accountable. And there was this tension all the time around whether or not they had done enough. And we said, well, actually, you basically abandoned these children. And there was really no proper protection for them. We also found that there had been a lot of subcontracting out to civil society organizations by UN agencies. And so when these contracts lapsed, then there was no support for the children. And so it really highlighted, I think, the systemic questions around whose responsibility is it? And we actually said that you cannot leave justice to the TCCs or troop contributing countries. This is simply not good enough. The second is who deals with investigations. And our investigation actually revealed that OIOS, who are responsible for these investigations, they themselves said, we don't really have the capacity, neither do we have the expertise to carry out these investigations. And then, of course, there was this question, so how do you deal with a matter that the UN treats as a disciplinary offense and deal with it from the perspective that these violations actually constitute crimes, and so they should be treated as such? And as a result, of course, of our report, what you had was the Secretary General, I think, in 2016 or 2017, issuing a report in which he really raised that there were 4 critical issues that needed to be looked at. He talked about impunity. He talked about the need for criminal accountability. He talked about the need to support victims and ensure that victims had support. And of course, arising out of this process, what you had was the appointment of 2 people. There was the USG, Jane Lute, and her job was really to look into the systemic questions. And then, of course, there was a victim's advocate, and her job was really to look into these questions of support for the victims. But, the underlying challenge, of course, is, if you don't do these investigations within a specific period of time, that's when the evidence gets destroyed. And so the question of whose job it is, I think, is an important one. Secondly, most troop contributing countries, the moment there's a complaint, they repatriate their members, and then, the unit there will try and settle it directly with the chief. And in traditional communities, money often is a problem. The third is, of course, the question of the UN's response. The UN is unwilling to accept any responsibility for the criminal accountability issue. And so even when they support victims, this is not done along the lines that it's reparations. It's usually done in formats which include support. And so for me, there's a direct correlation between impunity, the question of criminal accountability and who's responsible, and of course the question of, and that's tied to investigations which should be done jointly by a troop contributing country and the UN, and of course a domestic country if they have that capacity. And the third issue is really this question of damages or reparations. But the other issue, that there are two legal issues that come up often. The one is the question of immunity. And even though nobody has immunity according to the SG, if you are implicated in crimes of sexual violence, the reality is, of course, that immunity is often pleaded. The second, of course, is this question of transactional sex. And often these relationships are wiped out on the basis that, well, this was a transaction between two consenting adults. The problem, of course, is when you look at the context, you have to look at the question of the power dynamics and the unequal power relationships. And in that context, we actually suggested that they should never be able to use this as an excuse. Now, in 2018, I was part of a panel for UNICEF, which also looked at whether the sexual, prevention of sexual exploitation and abuse policies were in sync. And again, we raised three questions: criminal accountability, the need to pursue people even if they left, and the need to really dock their salaries so that those could be used to really build a reparations program for victims. And so I think that there's a big question around who should investigate those who are responsible. Can it be these structures themselves? There are many people who say you need an independent body. And I think these are some of the questions we need to tease out.
Thanks, Yasmin. I obviously have a lot of questions for you, but because we're getting so many really, really good questions from a lot of our audience members, I'm going to go slightly off-piste and start asking you just one or two follow-up questions from some of our audience members. Speaking to your point about reparations, this question is a really good one, and it's something that we have seen, we've seen come up from a lot of our audience members. This one is from Louisa, and her question is basically, assuming that a reparations program for victims and survivors of SEA perpetrated specifically by aid workers is created, what would holistic reparations look like, including but not going just beyond monetary compensation? What would it look like to enable survivors a way to actually rebuild their lives?
Thank you. That's a really good question. Remember, there is a sort of victims fund that is being used by the UN to support victims. But of course, what that doesn't have is what I would call a victim's bill of rights. Because I think that's where you really have to start with, and that is to consult with survivors of this kind of violence all over the world. And you need to ask them about what could be the measures that will help them to reintegrate. Now, just building on my experiences of many countries, the first is, of course, money is not everything, but what many victims tell me is what they would like to have is an acknowledgement that in fact this violation was perpetrated. And the acknowledgement should of course include the notion of who is responsible. The second is of course access to medical assistance, because as you know, many people following multiple crimes actually really struggle with how they deal with the medical injuries they suffer. And of course, going hand in hand with that is also trauma support. But I think that money is important because at one level, money enables people to deal with the consequences of the harm. And that is really around the question of how do you improve the quality of your life? Because often you find that you now have to look after a child as well. And then a fourth issue I would say is legal reform, because in many countries, children don't take on citizenship. That's what they're supposed to get from their fathers. And of course, the denial of this means that their children are often stateless. And so whether you're speaking about Haiti or Sierra Leone or many other countries across the world, this remains a challenge. But I think it's also about how do you educate communities, firstly about the rights of women, but secondly also how to deal with the question of stigma and reintegration. And if you speak to women from Haiti, from the DRC, to Sierra Leone, to places where these things have happened, the reality is, of course, once you have a child, there's a stigma, and in closed communities, this can be a major problem. Another issue, I think, is that this has to be done in consultation with women, because they usually know what the things are that they would like to see in a reparations program. So in my view, it has to be a combination of the acknowledgement, the money, the support services, and above all, I think, education. But we also need to improve mechanisms at community level so that women actually know where they can go to if they do have a complaint. And correspondingly, on the side of the UN, that needs to happen as well.
Thanks, Yasmin. Again, we're getting so many questions, and it's hard to keep up with them. But we're going to try to make sure that everyone's voice is heard, and I'm encouraging the panelists to answer any questions that you feel like you can immediately on the chat. So turning to Priyanka, given your experience, Priyanka, in actually working within the UN system as an attorney, I'm hoping that you can explain to us and share some of your inside knowledge in terms of the system, and how women could actually access it and turn to it to seek some of the justice. I'm also hoping that you can pick up off of one of Yasmin's points in terms of the transactional sex element, in that so many cases of these allegations are swept under the carpet or dismissed simply because investigators or heads of NGOs or UN workers don't view this as anything but transactional sex. Priyanka?
Muted. Hi, thank you, Paisley, for having me here. And thank you to Naomi for sharing her experiences. It's very important that we keep survivor stories central to our discussion. So I really appreciate her coming and sharing her experiences. So to your questions, to some of the discussions and the points that you raise, I think it's very, first of all, important to ask us, just as Yasmin pointed out, that frequently when you speak to the survivors, they have a very clear notion of what that justice looks like for them personally. And I find in my practice, I should clarify, when I worked for the UN, I worked for criminal tribunals. I did not work in the justice response system. But I was an elected staff union representative for the majority of my time with the UN, and that's how I kind of learned how the justice response system in the UN works. That particular body of law is called, generally it's called the International Administrative Law, and it has a very well-defined set of rules and principles and policy that back it. And I'm going to try to explain some of that with respect to a particular system of justice that exists and works not always as it should work, but it exists. But when it comes to sexual exploitation and abuse, the kind of experiences that we're sharing here today, those pathways don't actually exist in a way that they can be actioned at some point. So coming to what justice looks like for survivors, in my experience, especially as counsel for action against prohibited conduct, it has been voiced by survivors in very, very different ways. Some just want the abuse to stop. They really don't want much else. They simply want it to stop so that they can do their jobs, whatever their jobs were. They can get on with their lives. A step further from that is they want the abuser, the perpetrator, removed from their vicinity at the very least. And going from that, if they actually go ahead and launch a report or a formal complaint, in that case, they are looking for some kind of action and intervention from an organization. In that case, the first thing they want is an acknowledgement of the harm and a support, whether it comes in the form of psychosocial, which is typically the first stated need of survivors, and then support to navigate whatever justice system may exist. These are deeply opaque, deeply esoteric systems, and ordinary law practitioners will not necessarily even understand what is happening. And so as a former UN employee, somebody who worked with the system, I have some insights into how it works, and I'm able to support with respect to kind of navigating it, understanding the steps and stages. In the more egregious forms of abuse, we find that survivors do want punishment in the more traditional sense, that there should be a sanction that follows, and that sanction should be made public. And that the publicizing of the sanction is a huge part of building organizational culture of disapproval around that behavior, so that people know that there are costs and implications to that kind of misconduct. Last but not the least, survivors typically feel a great sense of disillusionment from their organizations. We have to remind ourselves that most of the people who come to work or leave their lives and travel around the world to work for aid organizations, they feel a great sense of mission and mandate. That's why they do it. And then when something like this, when a sexual misconduct is perpetrated against them or by their colleagues against recipient communities, there's a great sense of disillusionment when the organization does not show courage in owning it, in being transparent about it, and in taking the necessary steps for accountability. So I find that if you ask me personally to say what justice would be, a good justice system should be able to accommodate all of these asks. They're not big asks. They're very simple, straightforward asks. Unfortunately, the system doesn't always end up addressing it. Also, it's important for us to understand that from the international organization's perspective, this is not my personal endorsement of the system, but just trying to explain the system. They tend to classify sexual misconduct based on the survivor. So if the survivor happens to be an employee or in any form, some kind of professional engagement with an organization, sexual misconduct perpetrated against them by their colleagues is classified as sexual harassment and abuse. And sexual misconduct, sometimes even of the same nature, typically of more egregious sexual violence, when perpetrated against beneficiary communities, as they're commonly called, I think, the communities that are being served by the IO's mandate, international organizations mandate, those behaviors are classified as sexual exploitation and abuse. Now, definitionally, there are differences, of course, but both of these conducts can comprise criminal acts of sexual violence, no doubt about it. However, the justice system built around sexual harassment and abuse is far more robust, simply because that is a matter of employee rights, which you incur by virtue of your engagement with the organization. And so you have investigations and you have a policy of justice, a policy on code of conduct. That is not to say it works, but it exists. It works in some cases if the right people are there, the right places with the right intentions. However, I really want to underline that when it comes to sexual exploitation and abuse, I don't think anybody can actually identify a clear pathway to justice for those survivors. One does not exist, at least in as far as we have seen the stories that have come out from CAR, from Haiti, from DRC, the one that TNH broke on Beni, Congo. We haven't seen it because it doesn't exist in the system. And I think a huge reason for that is that the survivors who are members of the receiving communities don't have any access to the system in terms of power or rights. So it's very easy to simply say we are doing an investigation, and that is typically the response we find. So that is a response that you found with respect to the Ebola expose that you have done. That was a response with respect to the African Union Sex for Jobs reporting that Mail and Guardian did in November 2018. And again, robust investigations are great if you have good investigators and the will to investigate is actually there and it's not a political, eyewash. That does not necessarily mean there will be any form of actual accountability or action, even if the report very, very clearly finds that there was sexual abuse. Coming to the criminal aspect, these reports can frequently conclude that the conduct did amount to criminal acts. When that happens, that is for the first time that you will find any international organization for the first time start to use words that we use to describe criminal acts. So sexual assault, they will use for the first time then. Rape, they will use for the first time then. They will never, ever use those words until their own internal investigations have concluded that that sexual misconduct actually also comprised criminal acts. What has changed recently, some of the changes and improvements that are there in the system has been that there's been now a written acknowledgement that survivors are allowed to, or they're free to make criminal complaints. But as Yasmin mentioned, that is if the state where you are, whether as a recipient community or as an aid worker yourself, if it does not have a functioning legal system with rule of law and, basically where it actually works in a way that you can rely on it, it's not corrupt and it's actually transparent and predictable, then perhaps it's a real option. But in most of these situations where the kind of stories that you reported on and other people have, media exposés have reported on, those countries do not offer clear access to criminal accountability, frankly, just because of the situation and whatever crisis is ongoing there is the main reason why an international organization like the UN intervened in the first place. With both respect to sexual harassment and abuse and SEA, sexual exploitation and abuse, the justice mechanism is only, it's triggered with a complaint. And so frequently the response from the organization at the first point is like, we received no complaints, but there were no reports. And I think that's convenient, but it's really disingenuous. We know that reporting is low when there is no predictability on outcome. We know that if you go to the community in terms of outreach, when you're bringing an intervention into that community and you say, if something goes wrong, please call this number. But then you don't tell the community what happens when you call this number. Who answers? What can you expect? What is going to be the response? Are you going to be outed? Is it going to affect our mandate here? Are the rest of your community going to be deprived of the services we are providing by virtue of you reporting? Like, without those answers being made clear to the communities, nobody is going to call a random number and start reporting. And that is bearing in mind the power imbalance that is there, within a community that's being served. Even for aid workers, even to report your own colleagues, people are extremely cautious about impacting mandates, depriving, bringing a bad reputation, resulting in loss of donor funds. That's a huge reason why especially aid workers are very cautious about coming forward. I mean, putting aside retaliation, that is of course a huge reason why people don't come forward. So whistleblowers and bystanders who witness this kind of abuse, who can also come forward and report, it doesn't have to be a community person who reports. They're typically worried about their own survival in terms of like their careers, their jobs, whether they will get to keep doing it. And I personally have to say, I've said this before, if you see that happening and you lack the courage to come forward, then you have no business being an aid worker. If you see abuse being perpetrated by your colleagues and you are there and you're worried more about your career than about the lives of the community members that you are there to serve, you should get out of the business now. It really isn't where you belong. So coming back to the investigations, I really want to point out that, for example, the WHO has now said they're setting up an independent commission to investigate sexual exploitation in Beni. I think that use of the word sexual exploitation for that commission is very interesting to me as a lawyer, because if they describe it as sexual exploitation, they essentially deprive the women in Beni, majority of whom are former employees, of rights that they have as former employees. As former employees, they would be classified as sexual harassment and abuse typically in the system, and they should be, because it gives them access to all those rights. It seems like it is somehow lower in terms of, like, let's say, layman understanding of what they experienced. But definitely when it comes to response, the response is their potential to get a response and their power to participate and ask for answers, to appeal decisions, to actually get a copy of the decision, to ultimately seek compensation through an administrative court or tribunal of the UN. Those are only alive as long as they are classified as sexual harassment and abuse. They don't get to access that legal system at all if they get classified as sexual exploitation survivors. And I think that is not an accident of labeling. I think that mandate and that definition of the independent commission is telling of the intentions. And once again, it brings us back to the point of the investigations. None of these are time bound. We don't know who gets appointed to them. The recruitment, if they're purely insiders, they hired, they staff these people from the existing investigative bodies like OIOS that Yasmin mentioned. It's really the system policing the system. It doesn't work. We know it doesn't work. We have to be able to get independent investigators, and there are several groups now that provide those services. JRR, Justice Rapid Response, has a whole roster full of investigators that can be hired to do this. Eventually, when the investigation is completed and the report is submitted for a decision, somebody, whoever is responsible, in this case, it may be actually the head of WHO, but typically head of mission or the human resource section will take a decision. That decision may not even be available to sexual exploitation and abuse survivors because they're not seen as part of the system. And so they frequently will not know whether the investigation has been completed, what decision has been taken, and if at all any sanction has been levied against the perpetrators. For sexual harassment and abuse, i.e. if you're an employee or a former employee, as would be the case with the women in Beni, you may not come to know what exactly is the action taken, but you will know if action was taken or not. And at the very least, that provides some sense of closure and affirmation of the harm. It also entitles you to agitate in the courts, potentially for compensation and damages. The courts have recently been far more generous with that compensation. But I should say that the compensation system, even for employees, is computed against your salaries. So if you're a junior staffer or a national staffer, which is what the Beni employees would have been, local officers, it's computed in terms of your monthly salary, and X number of months salary will be given to you, the maximum usually being 2 years. So if you're a senior person, let's say a D2, you will get 2 years of D2 salary, whereas the women in Beni will get 2 years of their national salaries, which is nothing. So while we do talk about monetary compensation and their potential for reparation, I really think that the system that is designed to compute that is also deeply flawed. The harm suffered by you cannot be measured against your salary. Yeah, it should not be measured against your salary. It's important to note that for action against prohibited conduct, the reason we decided to start it, I decided to start it 2 years ago, was I know the system, and I realized one important point that Naomi made, that most people don't exactly know what the rules are and what their rights within those rules are. And so our approach has been to make available, first of all, the laws and policies that inform your rights. And so the first step is to know the law, and only when you know the law can you use the law to make the best of it for yourself. And hopefully through litigation, we can shape and change the law in a way that is more victim-centric. And so our approach somewhat is to use that system that has been built to kind of beat it if we can by playing the system's game. And it only works when we actually can agitate. It doesn't work in the cases of sexual exploitation and abuse in the same way because they don't have those rights. Yeah, I want to quickly touch on the issue of transactional sex that you brought up, Paisley.
Yeah,
think it's very,
we're gonna have to actually move to Caroline real quick because
okay.
we have so many questions coming in, and I really want to give Caroline the chance to also make some of her points specifically with regard to the whistleblowing issue. One of the things that we discovered in our investigation that was quite disturbing to us is that not only did women feel like they couldn't actually come forward and make the complaints because they didn't know how, or they didn't think that anything would come out of them. The other side of the story that we found is that a lot of aid workers who we actually spoke to knew very well that women were being sexually abused and sexually exploited and forced into these sex for work schemes. Caroline can speak to a lot of these aspects, but the one thing that I keep thinking about with our investigation is what would it have looked like for these women if the aid workers would have had courage to actually speak to their supervisors and go to their supervisors with these suspicions of what they knew what was happening. Caroline?
Thank you, Paisley. Pleasure to be here. And can I just say a big thank you to you, your team, Robert, Nelly, Diffid, who have brought this issue to light, reminding us that there's work to be done. But all of this takes me back, going to your question, to the work of Asmita Nayak in 2003 in West Africa. And here we are again, 17 years later, posing the same question. There was a great deal of goodwill in the system. Let's do something. So what is it that is going wrong? And I have to say, I've been committing these thoughts to a book in recent weeks. And I'm afraid to say that the system as we have it structurally is not a safe place still to report these issues. I listened to some of the oral evidence that was given by our colleagues who struggle with, well, why is we're encouraging people to speak up, but why won't they speak up? And Naomi and Yasmin and Priyanka, all covered this issue. It's because it's not safe to speak up. Perhaps, Matt, you can pop up that slide about what goes on in the mind of somebody that wants to report a complaint. Is Matt? There you go. So, you see people ask, should I do something? Can I make a difference? Should I be the one to do something? I won't say anything, or who should I tell? These are all the questions, that will be posed. But the unwritten silent code in the UN is that you will very often be retaliated against for speaking up. And this has happened, it happened with Catherine Bolkovacs, it happened with Tammy Fisher, who were all individuals who spoke up about this issue exactly and were drummed out of the system. So this culture of retaliation in this hierarchical UN structure is really something that's got to have the light shone on it. And plus the way that whistleblowers have been treated, like myself, litigated against for 15 years. We've currently got Emma Riley at Human Rights, who has spoken up and is having a difficult time from the system. So how you treat people that speak up is relevant. And if you, if you perpetrate structural violence against them, then they're not going to. And I have to say, Priyanka, you said, people should get out of the aid business. But when you see what this retaliation looks like in practice, a lot of senior women that are up there now will tell you they have seen it, but I was a single mum at the time and I couldn't afford to lose my job. So until we can shine the light on this retaliation issue, we're not going to move the system forward. And currently, those responsible for protection, staff-wise, are the ethics offices of the UN. And they were delegated in 2007 to each of the agencies. And retaliation is as difficult as SEA to investigate. And I'm afraid the results have been very, very disappointing. We see at UNHCR, I don't think that one person has been protected according to the Joint Inspection Unit statistics, more so in the other agencies, but still the ethics offices are not trusted and staff don't have confidence in them. So we really need to do something about that. You can take this slide away now, Matt, thanks. So there's no transparency in the decisions, and there's the judicial review that was once possible to open, the decision-making process is no longer possible. So.
Thanks, Caroline. And what do you think would have happened if more aid workers would have actually stepped up in the case of DRC?
I think there's certainly more power in unity, and I think if there had been a group that would have had the confidence to move forward, it may have made a difference. But one of the things is that many of the people that are deployed in the field are not actual staff members. They're employed on these consultancy contracts or service provider contracts. And as was outlined, they don't have the same access to justice, and they don't understand or know the system, and they simply don't know where to go. I mean, I do the exercise with my students every year. Find out where to report. You are the victim or the survivor of sexual abuse. Show me how to do it. Half the class, these are the brightest people in Europe, cannot figure out the mechanism. So it's just, if you're a survivor and you're in a community without a mobile phone or access to the internet, it's really, really difficult, as we heard from Naomi.
That's a really interesting point. So we, like a lot of webinars that I've dialed into myself, we have done a very good job of talking and trying to come up with some solutions to this. And we only have about 15 minutes left for many, many, many of the questions. I apologize to the audience members right now that we probably won't get to a lot of your questions. I do encourage you to reach out to the panelists. And hopefully after we publish our follow-up story, we could certainly help direct you to getting some of those answers if we're not able to answer them yet. I just want to turn to some of the questions that have come in. The first one is directed at Naomi. This is coming from somebody named Wendy. Her question is this: most of these abuses are perpetrated by men, in brackets, only a few men, but that is enough to cause problems. Would it assist if agencies made real efforts to address the gender gap, for example? Could agencies take affirmative action and only recruit women until such a time as the numbers were equal in seniority as well as quantity? And would this make any difference? That's a question for Naomi.
That's an interesting question. I know that we have been pushing for having more women within the aid system, but I would say not all of the workers within the aid system should be women. I believe in gender equality. What I will push for is a system that is accountable to the people that they are working for. So once we have a system that is accountable to people, and one of the things that I would say we need to push for more women to be at the top level of the decision-making table within the whole humanitarian sector. Not the whole humanitarian sector should be all women, but we should have more women at that top decision-making table where they can use the agency and the leadership to influence the change that we want within our community, where they dictate that there are women-specific needs doing it that need to be given to them, where they can also give their contribution, and people at the local level with the whole, there's one question I want to talk to and address quickly before I go. It's the question about how are workers accountable? Currently, what we are seeing now, especially within the RNGO and a UN agency, is that whenever there is a SEA being reported, they are more concentrating on protecting the agency, protecting donor funding than actually addressing the issue. And that is something that we need to start to talk about. People are reporting SEA cases, sexual exploitation and abuse, but what the agency, the UN agency and the INGOs are doing right now, they are putting on this protective mode. They want to protect the institution. They want to keep the funding coming from donors. So what happened to the survivors? Sometimes you are pushed far away and you are compensated in a set of way that is not still accountability or access to justice. Even what is happening currently within the sexual exploitation and abuse, when we are pushing for more local women to take leadership space, we are seeing within the INGO spaces, they are using the sex play. They are exploiting women-led CSO before they give you contract. They want to sleep with you. It's happening in Liberia. It's something that we need to start to discuss, that it's not just with the survivor or beneficiary within the community. Even women-led organizations that want to have access to funding to lead the cause and the change within the community, because of the way the donor funding is being made, you have to go through our INGOs. They are also, the workers are there also using sex to give money to women-led organization. So it's a system. We need a system that is accountable to, accountable for, and accountable with women, groups, survivors in humanitarian crisis.
Naomi, if you had to change one thing in the coming year to make sure that we could do something to provide justice or point women toward getting justice within the aid sector and these types of abuses that we're seeing, what is the one solution that you would look for or suggest?
I would say shift the power. We need to shift the power in a sort of way, is that we need to know that the accountability is not just as it relates to having funding, but we need to shift the power in a sort of way that we are accountable to the locals. We are accountable to the people in whose names we want to work for. So shift the power and be more accountable. That's what we need.
Thanks, Naomi. And speaking to this issue of power, we have an anonymous question that came in. I'm hoping that perhaps Yasmin and Priyanka, you could possibly speak to this. The question is, do you believe that the aid sector is capable of letting go its power to increase the power of local, national, and regional organizations, and also to reduce SEA? A couple other associated questions with that is, do you think that the aid sector and donor and UN agencies in particular needs to do a better job of naming the issues such as racism, colonialism, capitalism, and in order to do so?
Thanks, Paisley, and thanks to the anonymous questioner. I think this is a real challenge for both the UN and, of course, aid agencies. And the challenge, of course, is that in countries, particularly post-conflict countries, these are mini empires. And in fact, because of the donor funds they receive, the fact that they're able to distribute them or distribute services does put them in an unequal position. And so when something like sexual exploitation and abuse happens, there's this tendency to draw in and really to ring fence the organization to prevent any kind of attacks. And usually, I mean, when matters have, become public, that is the only time that you actually see action. And I think that, let's be quite frank, that in most INGOs in the UN, everybody knows what's going on. It's so obvious, but there's a huge question. Is there, can somebody who sits at a P4 level report somebody who's sitting in a higher rank? What are the mechanisms to do that? What do you do when there's retaliation against you? And even more so if you're a national staff member and not an international, the retaliation is quite swift. And it's not just from the individual concerned, but also from the INGO or the agency itself. And that really, there's no environment or culture to really deal with this issue. When we were doing the UNICEF, looking at their mechanisms in 2018, two things came up from the staff internally. What measures are there to protect me from retaliation? And what incentive is there for me to report? How do I know that this complaint is going to go all the way to the top? And another question that arose is, can any agency actually investigate itself, given the ramifications of the implications of when you actually find validity in the complaint? And so I would say that even the language that is set up in all of the systems doesn't really, it doesn't give rise to the fact that this is a very serious question. We're dealing with crimes which under the normal criminal law, you would prosecute as such. And of course, because, even governments, and I mean, there really are a number of cases in the UN. I think there was the case of this woman contractor in India who complained that her supervisor was sexually harassing her, and she actually laid a complaint at the police station. And you know what? The police said, well, actually, he has immunity, and so there's nothing we can do about the matter. The UN, of course, eventually did nothing and found that there was nothing to confirm in her complaint. But 2 or 3 years later, the police, when they finally got around to the investigation, actually found that he had not just done this to her, but he had done this to many other victims as well. So I think that what we're dealing with is also an environment which attracts predators. And any one of us who's worked in these countries will tell you that there is never any investigation done around the kind of people and their backgrounds and whether or not they've been implicated in complaints in other parts of the world that they've been working in. And so this question, I think, of a central place in which everybody's name is there with a record of whether or not a complaint like this has been made, this is long overdue. There were a number of questions also around the DNA issue. And of course, my view has always been, and it's something we suggested in the car situation, that before any aid worker or any peacekeeper goes out, part of the agreement should relate to the fact that a DNA sample should be taken and should be kept on the system so that if these allegations are made, you can actually go back to that. The other is also in situ, tribunals or court proceedings so that victims themselves can participate in those proceedings. So there's a huge, we're talking of so many different things. One is peacekeeper conduct, the other is contractors, and then of course in the agencies themselves, sexual harassment, which is such a nebulous term for really sexual violence. And I think that all of these issues need some attention in the future.
Right. So we have amazingly run out of time. However, I would like to ask in a rapid fire sort of way, one thing that you all would change. I've already asked Naomi this. If there's one thing specifically that you could change in the next 6 months to a year in terms of helping survivors of SEA come closer to justice, what would it be? Going over to Caroline. You're on mute.
Thank you, Paisley. I think it would be wonderful if the UN could find it within itself to talk to survivors directly. It loves to talk to itself. It does great work, but it needs to open its consultations and its brainstorming on this issue to survivors, to bring them in. I mean, we've heard about Naomi's survivor centered community dialogues. I mean, that is the path. And the UN needs to embrace that, and it needs to talk to people like Naomi about that. And that's what I'd like to change.
Thanks, Caroline. Priyanka?
Hi, thanks, Paisley. I personally would say that if if the organizations can show greater institutional courage and accept that the system is flawed, it's broken, and they need to, there's no amount of band-aid efforts that are going to fix it. They need to sit down and actually rebuild a new system of response that includes community sexual abuse survivors in it, not just currently what the system is that employees get access. And the system has to equally accommodate whistleblowers and build up that protection, that speaking up does not lead to being punished.
That's great. And one last thing from you, Naomi.
Yeah, I just think that the last part that Carol raised, that it's about time that we allow survivors to articulate their own issue. And it's about time that we listen to them and take concrete actions, not just listening. We are tired of talking. We need action. We need visible action. We need results. We need justice. We need to end the culture of impunity. We need people to be accountable. We need transparency. We need the UN system or the humanitarian system to stand, to do what they stand for. And if they want to build back better, is to build back better collectively with the people themselves. When women are raped, when women are sexually assaulted, when women are abused, and after conflict, they don't heal. And if you are building structure and you are not addressing the issue internally, you are not building a country. You are just covering up, and the wounds remain, and women continue to go through trauma. They go through stress. They need psychosocial support. So we need to listen more and take some concrete actions.
That's great, everyone. Thank you so much for being here. And just an update for the New Humanitarian. During the course of our investigation that we partnered up with Thomson Reuters Foundation, you know, a lot of people have come to us and said, thank God you guys are doing the work that you're doing. Unless you keep doing this type of work, the things are going to stay hidden. So a little bit of an update from us. Some of the questions from audience members were asking what we have planned. We can't give you specifics, but we can tell you that we are definitely going to be doing follow-up investigations in the Democratic Republic of Congo and in many other countries. We are not going to forget about the women who we've already spoken to. And we are not going to give up on this issue. Tomorrow is Giving Tuesday. If any of the people in our audience would like to dig into your pockets to make sure that the New Humanitarian is able to keep doing these investigations, I would humbly encourage you to do so. It's been great having everyone. Again, I feel like we could talk about this for days and days and days. I'm sorry that the panel was only an hour and 15 minutes. And I'm also very sorry for the fact that we couldn't get to all of the questions that members and audience members asked, but just rest assured that those questions will feed into all of our follow-up investigations. And we look forward to doing a similar webinar panel again. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you, Paisley.
Yeah.